You see, I'm not a religious person, so I think about religious things as metaphors for living, almost. That's a good way to think about it. I don't think of things as deities. I think we're all involved in various scripts and various patterns, and that images and metaphors and poetry, the things around us, architecture, things that we talk about, influence us in all different kinds of ways. Now, I really was impressed in the 60s, late 60s, when I went to a conference called Through the Looking Glass in Boston, which was about the goddess. And there were people lecturing about the goddess and showing slides of goddesses. Z. Budapest was speaking. And I was very impressed with the power that this could give women. The idea of seeing ourselves as beautiful in all of our manifestations, whether we're fat, whether we're thin, whether we're a bit oddly shaped in one way or another, the connection with animals, with birds, with ducks, with snakes, how some of these ancient figurines juxtapose the image of women and the image of the animal, or flowers, or hedgehogs, with the female body was very impressive to me. And I thought that this metaphorical shift should be encouraged, because we're also surrounded by gods dying on crosses and with long white beards, throwing stone tablets at people and condemning worships of golden calves. And even though I don't believe in these gods, they affect me profoundly. The fact that they surround me all the time, and they influence the way other people think and the way I think in ways that I can't even measure. So that I thought being surrounded with goddess images was much better. And I became interested in the goddess movement in that kind of way because I saw it as a radical shift in thinking. After that, I took a course with Starhawk, and I was very impressed with the way she worked magic. And the magic I understood her working was the magic of changing minds and of allowing the mind to expand in various different ways, because you would see different images, you would be inspired by different things. Your mind would be urged to go in new ways. And I loved it, so I thought the work should be encouraged, and I found the work to be very congruent almost with psychology, the kind of psychology, psychoanalysis I was interested in, which was also coming back to early childhood and coming back to memories of the mother, and the way sensuality animated minds was a reflection going on in psychoanalysis in many different ways. So the goddess was congruent with that way of thinking, even though I don't see the goddess as a theistic force. I see it as her as a human force, as a metaphoric shift, almost a way of living within art that I think allows for all kinds of interesting possibilities. For one thing, I see the goddess movement is very subversive, and I like that. I like that subversion. You're surrounded, I'm surrounded, you're surrounded, we're all surrounded with images of male gods. And these images aren't simply restricted to religion. They're also reflected in politics. Our idea of who should rule. An old white man with a long beard, that's our image of a ruler. Now, I'm not a religious person. I don't believe in deities of any sort. I believe in human beings, and I think we do incredible things to create our world. We create our world with metaphors, with art, with speech, and with our imaginations. So that I like the kinds of metaphors that are coming out of the goddess movement, because it allows us to change the way power is imagined in the world. The goddess movement talks about women as powerful, women as authoritative. It talks about women's bodies as being very interesting and very life-giving. It allows us to think of women's bodies as beautiful in all of their forms, whether women's bodies are old, whether women's faces are old and lined. The crone in goddess religion is so important. It values older women. So that I think that these metaphors have amazing social power. Whether or not I'm a religious person, I'm so affected by the male gods that are all around that I think it's a very good thing to have some female gods around, even though I don't believe in gods. I still see the power of these things as being very important.
So what do you think, what do you see Marija Gimbutas' work as? Why is that important?
Marija Gimbutas' work is fascinating. I first heard Marija Gimbutas at a conference in Italy in the early 1970s. I went to a conference in northern Italy, and was an archaeological conference, and I was a graduate student studying German at the time, and I took a train from Germany to come to the conference. And I sat through such boring papers about little tiny details of different archaeological obsessions, I suppose. And some of the papers were interesting, but none of them were surprising. When Marija Gimbutas got up to speak, and she began to show her these images, of which I was somewhat familiar, and began to show the patterns in those images. And she was just talking on a very elementary level compared to what her theory became a bit later, about the bird goddesses and snake goddesses and the patterns that we could see in old Europe as she was naming this period. She had me convinced of the fact that there were these patterns and that the patterns persisted over thousands of years. That was very interesting to me, that there were those images, that the images were enough to captivate people's imaginations for thousands of years, and that these images were not validated in our culture. They weren't the ones that were being in a sense, worshipped. They weren't the ones we were attending to. So I was very interested in thinking about these images as things that could become part of artistic imagination, of literary imagination, and of the imagination of people in everyday life. So I think Marija Gimbutas' work gives us a history of these images, and that way it makes the images more powerful. Now, was she right in the sociological theory she built up? Was she right about thinking about the different ways cultures were organized around these images? I don't know. I don't know if she was right. But the evidence that she compiled for the importance of these images is so compelling that I think the images need to be studied.
The thing is that when you were at that conference, you also had another experience besides listening to Marija.
Oh, I was listening to a man called the King's Archaeologist from Sweden, and he gave a paper about how there was one rock somewhere, and there were two footprints in the rock. They could have been footprints, they might not have been footprints, but look, here are these little indentations. And he built up a whole story about a male priest standing in the footprints that we have in the rock and doing this and doing that, and everyone thought it was wonderful. His creation was, to me, so obviously something he had made up that I was amazed that this gathering of scholars dismissed Marija Gimbutas' work, which seemed to me to be much more rooted in the images that she presented, than they did his work. They didn't pay as much attention to her work. They thought his work was wonderful. And now thinking back about that, and Marija Gimbutas accepted that very graciously, by the way. She was not upset by this at all.
Do you think she was used to it?
Yes, I think she was used to it. That's it. I think she was used to her work being rejected, but she was still a wonderful presence at these conferences. She was talking to everyone in whatever language they would talk to her in, because she spoke many, many different languages. And I think she enjoyed herself. She was doing her work, and she was presenting it, and she did not expect it to get a very warm reception. And she was quite She was quite right. You know, I see all of religions as making up histories. I don't believe that Jesus was resurrected, brought up to heaven. We know that there's so much disagreement even about the facts of the history of Jesus' life, his crucifixion, his mother, his father. But that doesn't matter. The fact that there's so many different ideas about what the figure of Jesus means, the fact that we can't really find out a great deal that's definitive about that history, does not stop this religion from taking over the planet. So it seems to me that the history of a religion is not anywhere near as important as the impact of the religious script that this particular set of beliefs gives to its followers. So Christianity gives a certain number of scripts to its followers, and Judaism gives a certain number of scripts, Islam does. Now we have goddess religion writing new scripts, and for me, that's fascinating. The goddess movement is about new scripts for humanity. People who are grounded in the earth, in their bodies, in thinking about the importance of nature, have got to work for saving the planet. You could not have a group of pagans do something like build a nuclear power plant, for example. The impact of that on the landscape would be something too horrible for pagans to admit, to be able to even bear. So that I think that that kind of positive social action and that positive way of thinking about human beings in the world comes from immersion in goddess imagery, which I can participate in, get very excited about, without believing in a goddess that is separate from the living world. Those images that she called our attention to have a great deal of magic. Magic in the sense that they transform. They transform people who look at them, who live with them, who handle them, who do art that's based on them. I think that that's very important. Seeing them and listening to her speak about them definitely opens my mind. There's several films about some of the things that Marija talked about, and I love to show them every year in classes because I get inspired by them. Now, what inspires me about them? Well, they're so different from the images that we're generally surrounded with that I get new ideas and new inspiration. I love thinking about those hedgehogs that she shows that are part human, part animal, and the ducks that have eggs in their buttocks, perhaps, that she brings that out. The bird goddesses that take away sometimes even the flesh of dead bodies, and then somehow return that flesh to living matter in their digestion and flying off. That gives me a lot of things to think about. So that I think if I were an artist, those images would inspire me to imagine the world in new ways and to create new forms, different forms, pottery. But I'm not an artist. I'm somebody who thinks. So, and I'm always thinking in terms of words and concepts. And those images inspire me to think about the groundedness of my own being and of the whole planet. And also the great beauty in a duck, the great magic in walking down to a river at the end of my street and seeing a duck and thinking about the images that Marija Gimbutas has drawn out about the association of ducks and women and how that big part of the duck looks very voluminous and looks like it might indeed hide some eggs. And to think that that was an image or that was an idea or even that was a fantasy within prehistoric people, we use that name, within the minds of Paleolithic people, I find that exciting.
Yeah, like what that word means to you, but...
Well, sacred is a real problem for me. I'm not even sure that it's a word that women's religions should use. I think women's religions, women's way of living with a sense of meaning and depth is more connected to everyday life than to things that are radically separate from ordinary life or ordinary thought. So the whole idea of sacred as something separate from what you do normally or what you think about normally is not something that I can ever really get behind in a big way. I like to think more of the natural, everyday world as being animated. And for me, that is some of the basis of goddess religion. I think the goddess theologians have a good point when they talk about how difficult it is for people to imagine the world in ways other than they know it right now. And I think the idea that there was at one time a peaceful world is a very important idea, because that would lead perhaps to trying to create a peaceful world now. Now, I can't know whether goddess people lived in a more peaceful way. From what I see of a lot of the evidence, perhaps they did. They seemed to build their towns in certain periods, in certain places, very close to the edges of the seacoast, for example. Now, why were they doing that? Why were they living there and not on mountaintops, which they could fortify, if they were at war? It doesn't make sense that they would be at war. If archaeologists such as Marija Gimbutas tell me they didn't find weapons in a given site, well, that would indicate to me that this was a fairly peaceful people. So I think that we need to look very seriously at the evidence. Now, probably the claims that there was a widespread, very widespread period of time when human beings lived in one way in all different parts of vast stretches of Europe or Asia. Perhaps that needs to be looked at in a little bit more detail. I think in particular places we can see from what we know whether something was going on in a peaceful way for a while or not. But I think there was probably more diversity in those societies than some of the hypotheses that we've been making, or that we see some people interested in the goddess movement making. But that doesn't mean that what they're saying is incorrect, because they might be correct. I might be too pessimistic about the ability of human beings to live at peace for a very long period of time. And I think that vision is very important. You have to remember that all historians of religion don't know very much about the deep religious past, and that much of what historians are talking about as the history of their own religions in the deep past is a great deal of conjecture. So why not have these sets of conjectures for us to think about?
All right.
Okay, is that enough?
No mercioso, matinite,